No. Ya está.
De acuerdo. Pues retomo la presentación. Decía que tenemos la suerte este curso de empezar y casi terminar, porque aún nos quedan algunas actividades, con dos de las figuras, por no decir las dos figuras más prominentes de los estudios de interpretación a nivel mundial. Tuvimos a Daniel Gil al principio del curso y tenemos hoy a Franz Pöchhacker, al que damos la bienvenida. Buenos días, profesor Franz Pöchhacker, y muchísimas gracias por aceptar nuestra invitación para estar aquí hoy. Es un lujo y es una suerte para nuestros estudiantes poder contar con esas dos conferencias, además de todas las actividades que estamos desarrollando en el programa de actividades complementarias de este Máster Universitario de Interpretación de Conferencias de la Universidad de Granada. Presentar al profesor Pöchhacker, pues nos llevaría mucho tiempo y voy a abreviar necesariamente, pero sí quiero pues situaros a los estudiantes sobre todo en sus principales aportaciones a los estudios de interpretación. Franz Pöchhacker, para empezar, es profesor de estudios de interpretación. Para vosotros quizás sería más fácil identificarlo como teoría de la interpretación, aunque sobre esa cuestión hay una reflexión terminológica en la que no sé si el profesor Pöchhacker querrá entrar. En el Centro de Estudios de Traducción de la Universidad de Viena, doctor por la Universidad de Viena y máster en interpretación con alemán como lengua A, inglés B y español C por la Universidad de Viena y el Monterey Institute of International Studies. Su investigación cubre una gran variedad de temas, enorme de hecho, que incluyen la interpretación de conferencias, por supuesto, pero también la interpretación para los medios de comunicación y los servicios de salud, o los estudios de interpretación en general como disciplina. Y en ese sentido es autor de varias monografías que incluyen el libro de texto Introducing Interpreting Studies, que se publicó en Routledge por primera vez en 2004 y se reeditó más recientemente en 2016. Es también coeditor de la revista Interpreting, que publica la editorial Benjamins, y editor de la Routledge Encyclopedia of Interpreting Studies, publicada también por Routledge en 2015. Para abreviar, como digo, porque su obra es extensísima, diría que quizá Pöchhacker es sobre todo conocido por el giro hacia el funcionalismo que le da a los estudios de interpretación a mediados de la década de los 90, con una primera publicación en alemán que no me voy a atrever a pronunciar porque es un idioma que no he estudiado, espero poder aprender alguna vez si tengo tiempo para ello, del año 94, y en el año 95 publica Simultaneous Interpreting a Functionalist Perspective en la revista de lingüística Hermes, donde digamos que ya marca esa tendencia de los estudios de interpretación a entroncar con la teoría funcionalista que ya se había desarrollado desde bastantes años atrás en los estudios de traducción y que por tanto sitúa la interpretación en una perspectiva distinta, sacándola del foco de la psicología cognitiva o de la neurolingüística, donde había estado muy centrada desde los años 80 sobre todo, para abrirla a otras perspectivas y también, por tanto, a otras disciplinas que tienen que ver con la teoría de la comunicación, con las ciencias sociales, para interesarse también por otros ámbitos donde se realiza la interpretación, que no son solo la interpretación de conferencias. Creo que Pöchhacker es uno de los principales responsables de que se hayan establecido puentes entre mundos donde se desarrolla la interpretación, mundos profesionales que estaban muy separados entre sí, como el de la interpretación de conferencias y el de la interpretación de los servicios públicos, también a nivel teórico y a nivel de reconocimiento académico, y por tanto esa es otra de sus aportaciones. Pero si habíamos pensado, fue una idea reciente, invitarlo a dar esta conferencia precisamente en este momento, puente también entre el final de las clases, los exámenes y dentro de poco el trabajo fin de máster, es porque precisamente en relación con ese enfoque funcionalista, una de las grandes aportaciones de Franz Pöchhacker, que siempre se cita en los trabajos de fin de máster de nuestros estudiantes, es su definición del hipertexto como situación comunicativa compleja que iría más allá de la suma de los textos individuales que lo componen y que estaría integrado por la interacción entre esos textos individuales. Esa definición del hipertexto, en la que se apoya en un estudio, en una categorización previa de Daniel Gil de situaciones comunicativas mediadas por intérpretes de conferencias, donde establecía 10 tipos de situaciones comunicativas. Pöchhacker reduce esos 10 tipos a 7 y define cada uno de esos tipos según rasgos distintivos que nos sirven en un trabajo fin de máster como el que nosotros hemos definido aquí en la Universidad de Granada, que tiene un enfoque meramente práctico, pues nos sirven para definir también los encargos de interpretación a los que se enfrentan los estudiantes cuando tienen que realizar un trabajo fin de máster, y es una de las principales aportaciones teóricas que siempre los tutores de estos trabajos pedimos a nuestros estudiantes que desarrollen, aunque sea brevemente, porque ya digo que la parte teórica de nuestro trabajo fin de máster es muy esquemática, muy sintética, y se trata sobre todo de que nuestros estudiantes puedan reflexionar con ese mínimo apoyo teórico sobre lo que implica afrontar un encargo de interpretación como último paso antes de lanzarse a la profesión, analizando un encargo real, analizando su preparación, analizando su propia prestación, las dificultades que encuentran tanto en la preparación como en la interpretación en sí. Y para eso, pues las aportaciones de Pöchhacker son fundamentales, y teníamos el problema hasta ahora, problemilla entre comillas, de que no todos nuestros estudiantes manejan el alemán, y donde el profesor Pöchhacker había desarrollado este punto concreto de su obra, pues eran una publicación en alemán que les llegaba a nuestros estudiantes a partir de una traducción que yo mismo encargué cuando realicé mi tesis doctoral, porque también me basé en esa categorización de los hipertextos o de las situaciones comunicativas mediadas por intérpretes que había realizado el profesor Pöchhacker como parte fundamental para apoyar un estudio de corpus que fue el objeto de mi tesis doctoral, como el profesor Pöchhacker sabe bien porque estuvo en el tribunal de esa tesis. Por tanto, queríamos que él pudiera venir aquí a explicarnos de primera mano sobre todo eso, además de todas las cosas que nos quiera contar. Nuestra invitación, evidentemente, tenía un foco en ese punto, pero estaba abierta a lo que el profesor Pöchhacker, que siempre tiene muchas cosas interesantes que decir en relación con la interpretación, pudiera querer contarnos hoy, ¿no? Pero bueno, esto es para explicar un poco, para contextualizar la razón de este encargo, ya que hablamos de encargos, ¿no? En este caso, el encargo de la conferencia del profesor Pöchhacker. Y sin nada más, pues le agradezco de nuevo enormemente su presencia, tanto como a los estudiantes que están aquí hoy y a los profesores y profesoras que nos acompañan, y le doy la palabra al profesor Pöchhacker.
Thank you so much, Jesus, for this very kind introduction, but also extremely appropriate and targeted introduction. It really saves me almost 10 minutes of my introductory explanations, because I was trying to, or planning to, recap what the purpose for this meeting was, the way we had discussed it, what the underlying motivation would be for my talk. And you have summarized and explained it beautiful. So for me, all I need to do is get on with it. But I did want to start as usual, and as on previous occasions, first of all, well, with a great word of thanks for the long-standing collaboration and friendship between colleagues in Granada, with me there in Vienna, dating back to the mid-1990s. I'm not sure all students are aware of that Vienna and Granada have enjoyed this very long-standing collaboration and exchange in various manners. And the other introductory remark I always have to make is an apology that I still have not managed to upgrade my C language, Spanish, which I like so much, to an active status that would permit me to give this talk in your beautiful language. So you will have to put up with me in English, even though if there are questions, they can certainly be asked and discussed in Spanish. And if there are people who want to pick up on something in German, if German is your B language, later on, we can also have a multilingual discussion if you think it would be hellish for the interpreters working here, but I guess the first part of the presentation will be more monologic. But let me also explain that the way I was briefed and the way Jesus has summarized it beautifully, there is a specific need on the part of this group of master students to get some input about some descriptive models that I have used in my own work. And I was actually planning not to lecture you for a whole hour to talk about theory a lot, but my main motivation and purpose here is to be available to you for your questions, for your doubts, for your, well, for the points you would like to raise, so that we can clarify some of the concepts or approaches to description that you will be needing in your master's thesis work. So this actually, the way we had discussed beforehand, is supposed to have a very practical purpose. This talk is supposed to serve a very practical purpose, and I am not planning to give you a reduced version of a big theoretical textbook. And yet, in a few minutes, I'll also mention my own motivation for doing this kind of work and maybe try to help you understand why some level of theory needs to come into this kind of work anyway, that we cannot just do practical work as interpreters and practical description of what an assignment or a conference is. Underneath such very practical hands-on efforts needs to be some layer of theory, some conceptual framework, and that is what I would like to present to you in this brief talk with maybe 2,000 slides. Some of them can be skipped, some of them we can return to and discuss at great length, always mindful of the overall purpose that you as the participants can shape this talk, especially in the discussion period, with your questions, with your suggestions and doubts, okay? And the other preliminary remark was that well, even before I did my own doctoral work, I had been working with some very experienced colleagues at an international conference, and for some reason, it hadn't gone very well. The three of us, it was a German-English bilateral booth, the three of us felt we did our job and probably did all right, but none of us had felt that we were really doing well, that we had really succeeded admirably in our job. And I was thinking, why was that? Was there anything specific about this conference that made our lives more difficult? Was it the speakers? Was it the topic? Was it the way they spoke? And so this idea was in my mind when I was asked what I would do a doctoral thesis at the University of Vienna. And this was when then an opportunity arose for me to record and observe and document a conference that was being held in Vienna, that I was involved in organizing. I took that opportunity and I did precisely what you, maybe on a smaller scale, are being asked to do in your master's projects. Here's a conference, now describe it. Tell us what it is like. And okay, so that was our joint purpose, and I started out and I thought, okay, but what do I need to describe? And that's where theory comes in. And if you don't want to call it theory, and also there is this parallelism in Spanish between teoría de la interpretación and estudios de la interpretación. In English, we don't talk about interpreting theory anymore as a designation of the field. So it's interpreting studies. And if you don't like the theory, I think the notion of models of the object of study are very useful. So I have called this talk a review of some models that have been designed to describe conference interpreting. There's a range of such models, and I would, in the monologic part of my talk, I would simply like to review the various models which I discovered I needed, because without any understanding of what a conference is, or the situation or the context, how are you going to describe it if you don't know which components and elements this concept comprises? And that's what brings me to the first slide. When we design models or use models to guide our description, we have to know what a model is. And it's actually quite simple to explain what a model is in any scientific field. A model basically tries to represent the object in two ways. First, by its elements or components. What does it consist of? What is included in this thing? And secondly, the relations or the connections, the links that exist between these components of the thing, the object, which can of course also be an abstract thing. You can, for instance, model democracy as an abstract construct, and then think of what are the components involved, what do you need to have this, and how do the elements hang together and interrelate. So this definition of a model, I think, can be useful. And so I set out to say, okay, I'd like to model interpreting. I'd like to model conference interpreting. And later on, also in my work on the introductory textbook, I noticed that there is not such a thing as a model, because the activity is so complex. It can be thought about at so many different levels. So, and there are different purposes for which we need a model. Mainly, I put here, I think we can use models to describe the object, but we can also have explanatory models or even predictive models. But basically, I noticed that models can be designed at a number of levels. And here is a model of these various levels, if you will, to just summarize that when you are looking for a model of interpreting, you have to first decide at what level of reference or what conceptual dimension do you want to think about interpreting. If you think about interpreting, for instance, the way it has existed through the ages in history, in relations between different peoples and civilizations, I call this an anthropological model of interpreting, a historical view that, for instance, says, what is the function of interpreting in discovery or conquest, which is a topic that is very relevant in the Spanish colonial historical period, of course. So what role do interpreters play? How do they work? Who do they report to? Who controls them, such as the Spanish laws, the 14 interpreters' laws of the 16th century, and so on and so forth. And then we can also model interpreting, model conference interpreting, as it says here as our overall topic, at the level of a profession in a given society. So how does interpreting work as a profession in a given society? And we're always focusing here on conference interpreting, but similar models have been done for sign language interpreting or court interpreting, for instance. And I'll just, after this brief review, I'll just show you one example of a model that became very famous, actually. It was done at this level, and it's a very useful model also for anyone interested in making interpreting their career. And yet it was actually done in a master's thesis. So yeah, keep in mind that some of your insights and work might make you famous after all, even though you are not seeing yourselves as the great theoreticians of interpreting, but master's level work can be extremely useful. Of course, also there can be models at the institutional level. Think of, let's say, the foreign ministry of Spain in different periods of history. What is the role of interpreting? Are there interpreters? Is there a need? In which languages are they trained? How are they hired? So you can look at interpreting within a given institution. The more obvious example is, of course, the European Union. Interpreting has a very high status in that institution. It even has a Directorate General for that purpose. And that's very interesting to think about, well, how did that come about, or how does it work, how is it organized, and so on and so forth. And there can be models. I'll show you one on the level of interaction. And I would claim that what I have tried to do with some of my models really zooms in on this level of interaction. How do the various interactants, as I call them, interrelate in a given conference? The speaker, the audience, the moderator, some of the things that you have seen played out here, even in this video conference, involves a network of interactions, and that needs to be understood if you, as interpreters, are immersed in that context and you need to understand what's going on. You can also be more specific about models and focus on texts, which kinds of texts are involved in interpreting, in conference interpreting. That has been done by some colleagues. And of course, the most popular level at which interpreting has in fact been modeled, and Jesus mentioned that in the introduction, has been the cognitive level, starting with David Gerver and Barbara Moser-Mercer and Daniel Gilles. Many colleagues have tried to explain and describe what is going on in interpreters' minds. Or if you take it one step further, you can ask what is going on in interpreters' brains, literally. Which areas of the brain are more active than others when certain interpreting functions are in operation? Which nervous systems, which synapses are more active? And you can measure this with imaging techniques such as computer tomography, functional magnetic resonance images. So this will be also, and there are experts in our field of interpreting studies who have worked on this. This will be another fine talk that you could schedule, have an invited speaker like Alexis Hervé Adelman or Adolfo Garcia, who have worked on this neural level of interpreting. But fear not, I'm not going to focus on the neural level of interpreting models, and I'm not going to discuss models at the cognitive level, but my focus will be very much here at the level of interaction in the context of what we simply call a conference or a conference assignment. But before as I promised, I would like to show one example of a model at this level, and that is the model developed in the master's thesis by Joseph Chung in Taiwan in the early 1990s. He wanted to understand or describe how the profession of conference interpreting had evolved and developed. And again, I'm showing this here not because this is our topic. We're not discussing professionalization, even though that's always a very deserving theme for a talk. But you can see a typical reflection, a visualization of what we said about the definition of a model. That is, it looks at the various components and elements that are part of it, and it looks at the relationships. And here the relations are very nicely suggested and indicated with various arrows, like for instance, training institutions interact with professional associations in achieving a certain consensus about what interpreters are, what they do, and under what conditions they should work. And you can take this further. There's legislation involved, legal authorities, for instance, need to regulate a profession until, starting from a chaotic market with no regulation, you reach all the way down in the final phase, in phase 4, professional autonomy, where the profession is to some extent in power in regulating access to the condition, to the profession, so who can call themselves an interpreter, and how can you become a member of a profession, and so on and so forth. So that's just an example before we look at models of the actual topic that's before us today, which is a combination, as we said, of interactional and interaction-oriented and text-oriented models. And I'd like to mention 2 of these here before I show and review some of my own models. And I really feel strongly that there is a need to show these models, because I want to avoid any impression that here is this man Pöchhacker who designed these models, who invented them, and these are the models that we should all use. Science doesn't work like that. Scholarship doesn't work like that. Keep in mind that some years ago, more years than I care to calculate, but let's say in the early 1990s, some 30 years ago, I was myself in a similar situation, whether it's master's level or a doctoral level. How do I go about describing and documenting what I want to work on? And so you look at other people's achievements and proposals, and everybody builds on what other people have thought and proposed and tries to adapt these other proposals to one's own needs. And it's been mentioned, and I'll come back to that in a few minutes, that for instance, my notion of the conference as a hypertext or communicative event builds on the work of Daniel Gilles, just like Daniel Gilles has influenced most of our generation of interpreting scholars. And we've all started reading Daniel Gilles before we went on to try and do other useful things of our own. And I hope that this process will continue. So if you have started reading Daniel Gilles or Franz Pöchhacker, you will move on and do useful things of your own. That's how scientific evolution is supposed to happen. And so this is just to show that other interesting models for thinking about the interaction situation or the textual interplay in interpreting, also in conference interpreting, come into play and should be considered, and that you might want to take an interest in this broader theoretical context, rather than assuming that, I need a model, so I take the one that Pöchhacker used because this is what my teachers require or recommend. It's very kind of them, and I appreciate it, but of course there's more out there in terms of models. A brief look at these models then. I'm not sure to what extent you have had a look at Kirchhoff's model, and this way of doing a conference via video link is not yet interactive enough to look into your faces and see whether you're saying, oh, we know this by heart, we know this very well, or oops, what is this? I've never seen this. This looks too complicated. So just a few words. It was a very early model, 1970s. And the model here is significant, I feel, because it doesn't only look at the agents involved, like a sender, or you call it a speaker, maybe in more modern terminology, and a receiver. A receiver, an initial receiver, which is the interpreter, but the ultimate receiver, that's why it's the primary receiver, receiver one, in the communication between the speaker and the listener or receiver. And there are messages involved. And the important thing here is that the message is not only consistent of words, but the message has a verbal and a nonverbal or an actional component. And to say this in the 1970s was actually quite a pioneering feat by Hella Kirchhoff working in Heidelberg. So interpreters are not only dealing with words, they hear from the speaker, but the message actually also consists of nonverbal components such as intonation, and especially working in Granada and knowing about the enormous achievement of Angela Collado Saiz, you're aware, of course, of the role of intonation and other prosodic nonverbal phenomena that are not visible, but they are audible, and they're also part of the message, and they need to be processed by the interpreter. Stress, intonation, rhythm, pausing, hesitation, and so on and so forth. So this also goes via the interpreter. But it's significant here that some of the nonverbal, the visual nonverbal components can be perceived directly by the listener, and so they become part of the message. And this should really be considered when simultaneous interpreting. There are only the audible nonverbal components, of course, but in consecutive interpreting, or maybe even when you have the interpreter there in a video link on a screen, the receivers can see the speaker's nonverbal components, let's say the gestures, the facial expression, the body movements, but maybe even the interpreters might be visible in this modern day situation. And obviously the model from the 1970s wasn't made to reflect that. So this is just a suggestion is that there are other models that help us see the bigger picture. And I've mentioned some things that are not even what is most significant for our purposes. For our purposes, you can see here that we're not only thinking about a message being produced, but as you will be aware, in the functional theoretical framework, especially as it was developed in Germany, the text or the message, the communication is always produced in a situation, in a situational context, whatever you want to call it. And nowadays, there is increasing recognition of the notion that translation or communication, any message production, is what is now called situated. It's a situated performance. And in this early models from the 1970s, you have message production as a situated performance. Okay, so this takes place in a situation, and that's what these squares are for. And the situation might be embedded in an institutional context, like a court of law or the European parliamentary session, and it's invariably also embedded in a socio-cultural context. Whether you are a conference interpreter in Spain, you are embedded in a different cultural context than when you're a conference interpreter working in mainland China, for instance. And there's a lot of activity going on, and there are these socio-cultural contexts also shaping what is done by the speakers, what is done by the listeners, and what is done by the interpreter. So this is just to give you a taste of an interaction model that I think also deserves to be used, mentioned, when it comes to thinking about what's going on when interpreting is used. And another model, I won't go into detail on this, just exemplifies a text focus. Silvia Kalina, who has also worked in this tradition at the University of Heidelberg, where one of the Granada graduates also is now currently playing a very active role. Rafael Barranco Droege, if you come across his publications, is another nice example of the Heidelberg tradition continuing, actually, or the Granada tradition continuing within the Heidelberg tradition. Silvia Kalina strongly built on the work of Hella Kirchhoff. So there's a lot of coherence there in theoretical approaches. And Silvia Kalina chose to think about communication processes in interpreted meetings in terms of the texts, the source texts, the target texts, and the cognitive background that is involved in this kind of textual communication, text-based communication and mediation. So these are just two examples of models that seem to be of interest, especially when in my own functionalist framework for the various descriptive models, I talk about such things as situation or text and how these could be described. So maybe in the next 10 or 15 minutes, we'll take a look at this descriptive framework that is expounded in detail, as was mentioned in my doctoral, in the published version of my doctoral dissertation of '92. So in the book that was published in 1994, Simultaneous Interpreting as Complex Action. And I'm aware that not much of the details has been published in English, so that is a bit of a problem. So we can review this with some original graphics and English language explanations. And this would then be the basis for our discussion after the presentation, where you are invited to share how you have been dealing with these models, or what you see as missing, or what your difficulties are in maybe applying these models for your purposes. But before we go into a set of models, the theoretical background needs to be mentioned or summarized ever so briefly. I had promised not to go deeply into theory, and I keep my promise, but still, what are these theorists that we would come across when we think about the foundation of these descriptive efforts? Well, I think a name, albeit very difficult to pronounce because it's a Finnish name, part of it, coupled with a German name, the name that deserves a lot of recognition and maybe through the decades never received enough recognition in the field of translation studies, is Justa Holtz-Menteri. Justa Holtz-Menteri had a very far-sighted sociological conception of what it means to work as a translator or also as an interpreter. And when this became known to Hans Vermeer, with whose work you're probably more familiar, and who again worked at the University of Heidelberg in the 1970s, working with Katharina Reis, but also Hella Kirchhoff. So it comes from that same context, academic context. This is maybe easier to understand, but Justa Holtz-Menteri was very unique in developing her very broad sociological or socio-professional approach. And the two of them taken together really give you a very interesting, stimulating framework very early on that matches many modern day proposals and approaches. Of course, much of this, again, was published in German, and worldwide, not too many people are really aware of what these German language authors had proposed early on in the 1940s. But what they did propose was that we should not look at the way words are translated or even the function of a certain text, but as Holtz-Menteri stated, what we're basically dealing with is that there's somebody who has a need for translation, a need for some mediated communication. So that's a client. And that client with a certain communicative need needs to collaborate with an expert who can provide that service. You can simplify this by thinking of a translation service, but if you think of the client as a conference organizer, then that client has a need for a team of interpreters who will ensure that multilingual communication can take place at the conference. So the client needs a service, needs to commission a service, and commissions that service from an expert for translation services. And as you may know, if you have looked into international standardization, I'm not sure whether that's mentioned in your course, but there has been a lot of development in terms of standardization of the activity of translation and interpreting by, and you'll know the organization, by ISO, the International Organization for Standardization, ISO. There are ISO standards for interpreting booths. I'm sure you have heard about those, but there are also ISO standards for quality and ISO standards for service provision. And how did I get into standardization now? Yeah. What we need when we look at, oh yeah, now I know, sorry. The translation and interpreting in the ISO standardization work aren't usually referred to as such anymore, but they're always referred to as translation services or interpreting services, and the translator and the interpreter, not that I like it that much, but they are usually referred to as the translation service provider, TSP, or the interpreting service provider, ISP. So the idea of a service has really taken center stage in the international and also national and European standardization efforts. And rather than using a label like an interpreter, this practice and the agent performing this practice is being referred to as a service provider, an interpreting service provider. This fits very nicely with this approach that, as I said, was developed by Holtzmann very early on, many years ago in the 1980s. So when we start by thinking about this relationship between a client and an expert, of course, the client has a certain goal, a certain purpose. Either I need to sell my product abroad in the Emirates, and so I need a translation of my advertising material or my brochure for my product into Arabic in order to do my marketing in a different country. Or if I want to present my new, drug that I've developed to fight COVID-19, then I will launch an international press conference. And I would want to make sure that whatever is said in English or in German or in Spanish will be understood by the members of the International Press Corps and journalists. So whatever the purpose, I need the right kind of expertise on the part of these experts. And they will know what is needed. For instance, whether for a press conference you could have a consecutive interpretation, or maybe if you only have one non-Spanish speaking journalist coming in from Germany, well, you could have somebody whisper interpret the press conference presentation. But the expert would know how the service can best be provided in order to fulfill the client's purpose. Okay, so that's the idea, that we start by looking at this contractual relationship between the client and the service provider. And within this relationship, you can consider the skills required in order to be an expert, the professional knowledge that such an expert needs to have. It's exactly what you have developed in the course of your master's program. These are the skills and the knowledge and the competences that make you expert enough to handle such a commission. So that is in my multi-level framework for analysis. This is the level of, it's called translatorial action. It's the professional action that we take that's based on a contract between the client and the expert. Okay, so here is where we start. Somebody calls up and says, are you free in 2 weeks? I have a delegation coming in and I need simultaneous interpreting, or I need a translator. Probably they say, I need a translator because I have some foreign visitors. And then it's part of that contractual relationship for you to negotiate and specify that contract, that assignment. Just Holtzmann was also very detailed about this phase, that you cannot just take a client's word when they commission a service, but sometimes they're not aware of the various options and possibilities or requirements, and so you need to negotiate this contract. I'm leaving out such important things as the fee that you're going to charge. I'm sure that that's also part of professional training courses. Here I'm interested in the assignment on a theoretical basis. So this is what we start with, and that basically defines the nature of the product. And if we're talking about conference interpreting, it's a meeting, a conference, whatever you call it, a communicative event. And even though the word hypertext is also used in information science as for a distributed text, it's available online where you can jump from one part to the other. When I proposed this term, I felt that this was not necessarily a contradiction, because a conference also consists of various parts where there are links between the sub parts, the individual texts. And so that's why the notion of hypertext just seems that it was designed to strengthen awareness that as an interpreter, you're not only interpreting a speaker's words or speech, but there's always a broader context. And the ultimate goal was to describe what this broader context is and what might be relevant to be described when we want to understand specific aspects of the interpreter's performance. So this is what we are going to go into more detail about. But of course, we've said within that conference, within that communicative event, there's an important level also that is called the situation here. Interpreting is a situated activity, and we need to have some way of understanding what is the situation, what does it consist of, how would you in your thesis project describe the situation, what are the components and relations between those components when you want to describe the situation. So that's why the situation is also here as an important descriptive element. And within a given situation, however defined, you have a text or speech. I'm using text in a very broad semiotic sense. So a spoken message or a signed message by a deaf person or a sign language interpreter, that's also a text, whether it's visual or spoken or written. And this is in English they would call it the discourse, a piece of discourse that functions in a given situation. And this is what specifically interpreters are then called upon to work on, like a certain presentation, a certain speech, or even a question raised by someone in the audience is also a given text. And when we analyze that text or describe it, that's fine. We focus on the text level, like Silvia Kalina focused on the textual level, but we always need to be mindful, like in Kirchhoff's model, that the text doesn't just come about in a vacuum, but there is a person producing the text. Maybe there was a person, a copy writer presenting the politician's text before it is then presented or read by the person from the rostrum. So the situation is something you would want to also understand when you look at individual texts. So this is basically how I would explain my overall framework that goes from the contract to the text. And you can, of course, go even further because many studies in interpreting do not look at texts as such, but they're interested in specific elements or components of a text, like numbers in a speech, the difficulty of interpreting numbers or names or idioms or technical terms, the terminology used by a speaker. All of this could be part of the textual level, and in your thesis project you could perhaps focus on these individual aspects. So these would only be segments of the text, right? Not entire texts. You could just pick out let's say, the terminology used and then see how the interpreters cope with these terms or with anglicisms, or there's a vast range that has been studied by individual scholars in interpreting. And I'm concluding this overview of the framework by adding the functional dimension. After all, we talked about a functionalist framework by saying that when you discuss the strategy for an interpreter, you usually...
Disculpa la interrupción, es que tenemos problemas de sonido desde hace algún tiempo. Estábamos esperando a ver si pasaba, si era por...
I'm sorry.
Estábamos pensando intentar con otra plataforma, con Meet, a ver si hay más suerte.
Okay, so you have trouble hearing me, or where is the problem?
Ahora va bien, ¿no? Ahora va bien.
Ahora sí, es que ha habido momentos mejores y peores y pensábamos que podía ser pasajero, no te queríamos interrumpir por eso.
Oh, I'm very sorry. No, feel free to interrupt anytime, but okay. But
No,
it seems...
ahora funciona muy bien, ahora se escucha perfectamente otra vez. O sea, yo creo que podíamos intentarlo y si vemos que vuelve a pasar, pues igual pasar a otro
Exactly, and we'll just make a deal that whenever there's a problem again, just come in, cut in, and says, wait a minute, wait a second, repeat something because there are acoustic problems. So, well, the good thing is for the students is anyway that this is still the theoretical overview, and it's all, most of it is captured in this scheme, so you haven't missed much of what we actually want to discuss. Maybe I've been talking too fast or too many theoretical bits. Anyway, let me complete just this slide, and then we'll come back at the hypertext. And whenever there are problems, please feel free to draw my attention to that so that some things could be repeated. As a matter of procedure, I have been working with various platforms, and to date, not that I want to make any advertising there, but Zoom, with all the problems that may arise, has so far been the most stable for a larger group of participants. So I would not be convinced that switching to another platform would avoid such difficulties. So let's give it another try, okay? So we talked about some functional elements. They would, like when you talk about an interpreter strategy, they usually focus on an element or a segment of a text within a situation. When I talk about the whole text, I apply the term function there. What is the function of a speech? What is the function of a text? And then you can add to that the scopus, because sometimes it's not clear how does the scopus come in. The German theorists also were not always very clear in making a distinction between function and scopus. And in my work, at least, I tried to separate the two by using the term purpose or scopus at the hypertext level, meaning what is the purpose of the conference as a whole? What is going to take place, rather than what is this particular speaker in his speech going to achieve? So the function of an individual text and the scopus of the hypertext. And if you wanted to add something further, of course, at that level, and it's been mentioned before, you have notions like professional ethics and professional standards also of the client. And just a final word on the ethics, obviously somebody might call you up to ask you to be an interpreter at a rally of right-wing extremists. And that's where, at the contractual level, that's where ethics comes in. Will you be willing to work for a certain group for certain purposes, or will you decline that assignment because it conflicts with either legal provisions or even your personal or professional ethics? So ethics can also be brought into this bigger picture which comes in right at the beginning when you have to decide whether you want to work with certain people for certain purposes at all. Okay, so this was basically just to situate the concept that apparently has attracted most interest, that is the hypertext. And a couple of slides can be used to review what I understand to be the hypertext and what uses it might have. And then I think we can leave open whether we want to look at the text level. And the sooner the better, probably, if we manage to move into a more dialogic discussion mode. At this point, is audibility okay? Maybe you can just give me a thumbs up, Jan. Okay, so we'll carry on, and if something untoward happens again, then please interrupt. Okay, so within this framework, I was interested, and I think all of us should be interested, if we're interested in conference interpreting, then the notion of a conference deserves a lot of attention. And my feeling was, and to some extent still is, that even though conference interpreters work in a conference situation and in conference settings, not much research, even empirical work, is being done at that level. My assumption is that what happens at the level of the entire conference has an impact on what we do as interpreters in the booth. And that's why we should look at this broader level of context. This is another very old-fashioned design that I used in my book, still labeled in German, simply to find another way of visualizing the interaction between the conference dimension. There is this conference level, and within the conference level, as was suggested in the overall design, there are individual texts, let us say speeches, presentations by various speakers. And at a conference, in between, there's also interaction. There's interaction between the members of the interpreting team. There's interaction between the chief interpreter of the team and the client, maybe in order to get documents or texts that are being used or access to slides. So it's not all about text, but it's also about people. So texts as part of the conference level or the communicative event level, and interaction among various people. And there are some interesting studies that would be nice to mention here by other colleagues who have focused on the fact that there's more going on than texts that can be recorded and transcribed at a conference. Ebru Dirica described much of this in her work, in her PhD. And one of my favorites really is a recent book based on a thesis by Verle Duflou, done in Belgium. Verle Duflou describing all the various forms of interaction that are going on in the interpreting service, DG SKIC, when interpreters work, or even also at the parliament. So the interaction has been picked up and analyzed and described by some other scholars, whereas I would have to admit my focus was still very much on the text level and the notion that all these texts make up the conference level. But what is important for your purposes here is this prior stage, before the conference even starts. And this is a very important point that you are very keenly aware of course. Basically, the assignment starts here. When the client calls you and you say, okay, I'll do this, send me the contract, I'll sign it and return the signed contract, or you have my word, it's an oral contract, whatever. But this is the Auftrag, the commission accepted, the contractual arrangement established. And so I think in interpreting studies, we should also devote a lot of interest to this preliminary part that takes place before the conference even starts. This means preparation, right? There's a lot of preparation. Sometimes we don't have any documents, but we could maybe find out who the speakers are. And nowadays you can go to YouTube and try to find speeches by certain speakers so that you know what they talk about, what they feel strongly about, and what images they use, and so on. And then you can do specific research on speakers' backgrounds, on terminology that comes in. And in some conferences, at least in the old days, there were speakers' briefings so that you could, before the start of the conference, the evening before the start, you could actually get together with the main speakers and ask them about some doubts that you had about their main models. Or like if I were the speaker, we could have an interpreter's briefing before I would give this talk at the University of Granada. So this is a very interesting preliminary phase at the hypertext level before the conference actually starts. And I'm also encouraging master's thesis to focus on this level. Like, how do you prepare, what material, what resources, what software tools can be used by conference interpreters to prepare for the conference and to prepare for the individual parts of the conference that they will then be asked to work in. So this is just another visualization to emphasize the interrelation between texts and the conference level, but also to point out what's going on before the conference starts. Well, I'll briefly review the notion of conference types or hypertext types. We mentioned that there is a need when we describe this to well, to put some order into this very great diversity of phenomena. And of course, we cannot easily classify conferences. Every conference is in a way unique, but then maybe there are some types or prototypes. And once again, it's been said that in my early readings, I came across some work later on by Daniel Gilles, but first actually by Claude Nami, who worked in Geneva. And this was his typology of conferences or events where interpreters would be working. He said you would be at a didactic meeting, at a rhetorical meeting, emotional meetings, he singled out, technical meetings, negotiations, legal meetings, diplomatic meetings. I think it's interesting to look at this early proposal for a distinction between different meeting types, but you would soon discover that the criteria used here are not all that coherent. For instance, emotional meetings could come up in different contexts. And diplomatic and legal and technical or negotiating, it's hard to keep those apart. So I'd like to mention this early proposal, but I think the one that was more thoroughly considered was Daniel Gilles, and you know his 10-item list of types of meetings in conference interpreting. And I have to just stress that he thought of conference interpreting in general, whereas later on I narrowed it down to simultaneous interpreting only. But this list, the major scientific technical conferences, seminar and training events, working meetings of international organizations, negotiations, ministerial visits. He says, and for instance, I thought with ministerial visits, you would very often get an assignment for presumably consecutive interpreting. One of our colleagues in this field, Dörte Andres, maybe you've heard her name, she works in Germersheim, professor of interpreting studies in Germersheim. For many years, Dörte Andres was an interpreter in a ministry in Germany, and she was doing a lot of consecutive interpreting because these bilateral ministerial meetings, in her experience, were done in consecutive many times. Of course, they can also be done simultaneous, but here I thought, well, ministerial visit, that sounds like something that is typically done in consecutive. Parliamentary debates, by contrast, would be a case of simultaneous interpreting. And then broadcast discussions, broadcast events, of course, very often done in simultaneous mode, press conferences, and invited speakers or invited lectures. So this is the list proposed in a paper by Daniel Gilles, and also in one of his several doctoral theses, I believe, in the 1980s. And I built on that, and I tried to kind of condense it into a manageable, coherent, and official dinners were also official dinners, obviously, typically in consecutive, but also simultaneous. So taking this list, I proposed a similar list. It's highly similar, of course, acknowledging that it's basically building on what Daniel Gil proposed, and my proposal, translated here into English, has these large statutory assemblies of international organizations. Most international organizations have to have an annual meeting, or then my second prototype for conference hypertext type is the technical scientific conference. Then, as you've seen also by Gilles, the seminar or training course. Then working meetings or negotiations. Any body that tries to work out some texts or resolution or drafts or a document needs to get together and have a discussion. And this is what I mean with a working meeting. It's, of course, very specific and could be of different types when something is being worked out or negotiated. And then a very open type of meeting where somebody decides that there is a topic that needs to be discussed in a social setting, and a conference is organized. Let's say a discussion about racism in various countries, and you could invite some speakers, and you would have an active audience, and you could have a discussion and presentations. And so this would not be part of an international organization necessarily. It wouldn't be a seminar or a technical conference. This would be an international gathering. People speaking different languages are present to discuss or contribute to the theme of a particular event. Okay. And then a press conference or an invited lecture as completing the 7 types that I thought were needed in order to reflect the diversity of assignments. For instance, the ministerial visits or ministerial meetings for me would come under a working meeting. Might be bilateral, could be multilateral. So I was trying to condense the list a little bit. And back then also I thought that official dinners, interpreters working at dinners, was usually done in consecutive. And please remember that my work in the 90s was specifically focusing on simultaneous interpreting. So I felt that official dinners would not need to be included.
Franz, disculpa, está fallando otra vez bastante el sonido. Me preguntan si habría alguna forma de... No sé, antes simplemente por parar mejoró, pero luego ha vuelto a empeorar. ¿Podría revisar si hay alguna conexión del micro que pudiera estar un poco suelta o algo así? Supongo que está todo bien, pero por comprobarlo todo.
Yeah, were you asking whether something was amiss at my end with the microphone settings, perhaps? Because my setup here is very fixed, and there's really nothing that could change, and I haven't really touched anything.
Ja.
Jetzt geht es aber gerade wieder besser. Ahora mismo war mejor otra vez. Wenn wir unterbrechen, geht es plötzlich wieder besser.
Yeah, so maybe we should interrupt more often, and we will soon be doing that anyway when we have people asking questions, and then we can make sure whether we have heard the question and understood them. So, well, bear with me for another maybe 5 minutes. So this is the list, and I'll just exemplify the features that you know. I was trying to think of how can these 7 different types be distinguished. And one is the structural complexity. There are very complex meetings, and there are very simple assignments where, let's say, somebody comes in and gives a talk. That's the assignment. So that's the minimum of complexity or the least degree of structural complexity. And the press conference is also a rather simple structure, whereas a technical scientific conference with many parallel sessions and plenary discussions and speakers can be extremely complex. And since I was describing such a technical conference in my PhD work, I thought that this idea of structural complexity was interesting to keep in mind. And then to think about the situation. This is already, of course, the situational level. Who are these people in the room? Do they all share a certain cultural background or a knowledge background? Or are these very different sociocultural backgrounds? Again, I will remind you of this model by Kirchhoff with the sociocultural background of the speakers and the listeners. I think this is also something one can reflect about. Then information, is this about transmitting a lot of information, or is it more about discussion, negotiating, persuasion? So this would be the polarity there. There are certain meetings where no new ideas are put on the table. It's all clear, for instance, that the negotiating partners have different opinions, and these opinions are known. The question is, how can a compromise be worked out? And there would not be a lot of what I call informational intensity in such a meeting, right? Whereas at a scientific conference, researchers might have 10 minutes to present the research work of the last 2 years. And so this is extremely dense and fast and packed with information. So this parameter of informational intensity can be used to make distinctions or describe different meeting types. And then, at least in the 1990s, this seemed very relevant. Is there any visual material involved in the conference? Again, in some negotiations, there's no visual material, but in technical presentations, nowadays in most talks, there's a lot of visual presentation material, just like in the talk that I'm delivering here. And then finally, the fifth parameter for describing a meeting and differentiating different meeting types was the interactional dynamics or information flow. Is this coming from one speaker to the listeners only? Or is there a lot of back and forth or exchange among the participants in the meeting? And this could also be interesting as a descriptive parameter, I feel. And this is merely an example. In German, no, it's in English, for the technical conference, and these thoughts kind of suggest where I would put the values. They're more or less, and so pretty high level of complexity in terms of structure. And for technical conferences, I suggested that there would be a lot of cultural homogeneity, but I need to explain that by cultural, I did not mean whether people come from China or Japan or Germany, but they're, in terms of their mere, the members of a particular scientific discipline, for instance, can also be referred to as a cultural group. Vermeer calls it the dia culture. And this is not the national socioculture, but the dia culture makes such a group very coherent. And at a technical conference, usually when it's all medical researchers or all politicians, this is a very homogeneous dia cultural group, even though the national cultural backgrounds might be very different. But in such a meeting, the speaker's national background doesn't really usually play such an enormous role. If you present findings about a new drug that you have done research on, whether you have done that in California or China or Germany is not the main distinction that would be made, but it's about methods and results and statistics, and people kind of share a common language if they're scientific in a scientific technical meeting. And then a lot of information, I would suggest, a lot of visual support materials. For many decades, medical researchers have used a lot of visuals in their meetings, and not that much interaction, maybe, when the speakers present their work and the listeners try to pick it up and understand. Okay, so this is one example of how I would see the 5 different parameters to describe the different conference types or prototypes or hypertext types in a certain, in a structured way. I will probably stop here. The remaining slides talk about the situation. There are only 4 more slides. Maybe I can run through them, but I won't go into them because I think I haven't been watching time, but we have been going on for quite a while now. And so if we discuss interpreting, we should also look at the situation. And I say the situation depends on who is there and talking to each other. Okay, so just find a way of describing who the participants are. What do they know? What do they want at this event? This is what I have this interactive model for, about what do they know, what is their purpose, what is their role, what are their personal backgrounds, what's their perspective on the meeting. So this is situation. And if we look at the text, this visualization might help you, become more aware that the text is not just words that on a page that can be counted, but the producer of a speech at a conference has a whole range of verbal, paraverbal, nonverbal resources to draw on. And what the listeners receive, if you look at it from this bottom level, is both auditory or auditive parts of message, the words you hear, the prosody, the voice quality, but also in many ways visual. It could be visual texts or pictures, but it could also be the speaker's visuals, the facial expressions, the gestures. And so the message, just recall briefly the message that we looked at with Kirchhoff. That message is a multi-semiotic whole or a multimodal complex. A multimodal complex. And when you're an interpreter, you're not only interpreting words, but you have prosody, you have written text on the slides, you have speakers, facial expressions, and gestures, and so on and so forth. Maybe I should add here, because I'm using this a lot, you also have the speaker's pointer, right? This is another visual element. And for an interpreter, it could be confusing, but it could also be helpful. If I'm saying, let me show you another important part, and if I point here, then without even reading or hearing a word, you are thinking, posture, how am I going to translate that, right? So pointers, emphasis in visualizations can also be useful. And then the final slide would be if I have a text and I need to describe it, don't worry about the specifics here, but I thought such things as the speed of a text, the speed needs to be accounted for. How fast is the speaker? And how many pauses and so on. And I'm looking at this left-hand side. Who is this addressed to? Is the speech addressed to the plenary or just a few people? Like when the speaker asks back to the journalist at the press conference because the question isn't clear, then that utterance is addressed to only one person, namely the journalist who had asked the initial question, right? So this is whom is this addressed to? And these two scales refer to the fact that delivery of a text or of a speech can be done in very different ways, from reading to completely extemporaneous presentation, and from the use of notes to the use of a printed text. And when you are asked to describe the texts and the speeches, I think some of these parameters should also be mentioned in order to try and document what the speeches were about in the conference that you are going to describe. And at this point, I'd like to stop, and maybe even later on stop the screen sharing, and it's high time to hear your questions or comments and move into a more interactive mode of things. Thanks for listening up to now. I hope the sound has been working all right.
Bueno, muchas gracias, Franz. Lamentablemente el sonido y los hados de la técnica no nos han acompañado hoy. Pero bueno, creo que lo más importante de lo que tenías que decir se ha podido escuchar, se ha podido seguir. Y a ver si con esta nueva interrupción tenemos la suerte de que vuelva a mejorar. ¿A mí se me oye bien? ¿Sí?
Sí, se te oye bien, sí.
De acuerdo. Pues bueno, es el momento de las preguntas. Si tenéis alguna duda que queráis aclarar, sobre todo pensando en el trabajo fin de máster.
Sí, yo tengo varias preguntas.
¿De acuerdo?
Que puedo formular en español o alemán. Bueno, las voy a hacer en alemán.
Por mí, quizá en español, para que escuchen todos en el grupo.
Vale, pues estaba pensando en los intérpretes que tienen alemán.
Ah, sí. Bueno, entonces
Sí,
alemán.
pero Celina, lo que pasa es que no todo el mundo está en Discord, entonces quizás mejor para que todo el mundo te entienda si lo puedes hacer en español. ¿Vale? Si no te importa.
Vale. Pues en primer lugar, muchas gracias. Ha sido muy interesante. Yo soy de Viena, así que conozco muy bien su trabajo, porque en el grado lo hemos trabajado bastante. Y también hemos trabajado mucho los modelos para describir textos y todos esos aspectos que son importantes. Y yo quería preguntar respecto al trabajo de fin de máster, que va a ser a través de Internet. Y quería preguntar si estos modelos y estos aspectos para describir textos cambian básicamente cuando es interpretación remota o interpretación a través de Internet, o si siguen siendo los mismos modelos y el hecho de que sea a través de Internet solo es un punto que se tiene que tener en cuenta, o si cambia completamente todo este modelo de describir los textos.
Thanks. That's, may I respond, or did you want to add further questions? Or maybe a response at this point will be okay, because this is a fascinating question. Of course, it's an obvious question, and I could simplify my response and situation by simply saying, well, that is precisely your task in your thesis. You take these models and you ask this very good question, saying, how would these models serve my purposes of description in a video, in a remote interpreting situation? What will stay and what needs to be added, and to what extent do these models need to be adapted? I would think that a certain level of adaptation is needed, but of course, the main components, for instance, that the text is a multimodal complex, that will stay the same. Whether in this case, I think the main change is the perceptual conditions. The perceptual conditions, whether I'm looking at the slides on the conference hall screen, or I'm looking at the slides on the computer screen, where I cannot at the same time look over at the presenter's facial expression, right? Because it's only a small insert. Those would be interesting perceptual changes, but the basic factors, I would think, would remain the same, especially the hypertext types, whether it's an invited lecture, whether it's a negotiation, that will remain the same. But the focus would be on perceptual conditions. How does the screen mediation make a difference? And I think it would be nice if you try to use these models and see how the perceptual component comes in. If you briefly looked at the situation models, you know, these strange creatures there with knowledge and with the arrows, then you see that it has one arrow saying perception and orientation. And this is where you could pick up. It says the situation model already involves perceptual conditions. Who can see whom, how, when? And this is what I think would require probably additional models to do justice to this remote interpreting situation. But probably the conference models, the text models as such, don't require that much adaptation. I think this focus needs to be on perceptual conditions.
Gracias. Celina, creo que decías que tenías más preguntas, ¿no?
Sí, tenía otra pregunta que también tiene que ver con la adaptación de estos modelos. Yo me he enfocado en el trabajo fin de grado en la interpretación comunitaria y me he concentrado en otros aspectos, pero quería preguntar si estos modelos para describir la interpretación de conferencias también se puede adaptar a la interpretación comunitaria o si también cambia completamente. Es similar a la pregunta que he hecho antes, pero solo es a otro.
The question is similar in the sense that it is a similarly good question. Thank you. It's a very intelligent question. And I would say clearly, whatever we say about the conference can go out. We don't need to talk about a conference assignment or conference structure or conference type anymore. I would say the event type is definitely a good topic, but you need new models because it depends. Community interpreting has a disadvantage that it is a very broad label. And whether this is in a legal setting or an educational setting or religious makes a big difference. So the first step would be what kind of domain within community interpreting? Is it healthcare? Is it legal, police, asylum? And then you probably need to describe the type of event. It's the difference whether asylum hearings, for instance, are conducted by the official charge, if it's the official hearing, or whether you have a consultation by an NGO trying to help asylum seekers, because of the power relations and the purpose of the event. The one is more an interrogation, and the other is more supportive information giving. So I would still look at the event first. But what's happening at the event? And then I think the main focus would be on the situation. And I think for the situation model, that what I have shown there and what I've used for conference should be pretty helpful also for describing interaction in a community-based setting, because you have the 3 or 4 or whoever interactions and you try to explain their roles, their knowledge, their power, their so yeah, at the conference level maybe, but the event, the nature of the event to start with, and then I think you could use the situation model to describe the individual interacting parties, the interpreters, the client, the police officer, the doctor, whoever. Thanks.
¿Alguna pregunta más? No sé si Celina tenías todavía alguna más o alguien más quiere preguntar.
Sí, yo tenía otra pregunta, pero era más bien para entender Pero si alguien más quiere hacer una pregunta, yo tampoco quiero hacer demasiado.
Well, 3 is a good number. All good things come in 3. Let's have your third question.
Yo quería preguntar, porque no estoy segura si lo he entendido bien, que si estos distintos niveles en el modelo de escribir un encargo de interpretación están siempre presentes o no. Por ejemplo, el nivel sociocultural y el nivel textual, si todos esos aspectos que están en estos círculos siempre están presentes en cada encargo y uno se enfoca en uno o en varios, o si hay algunos encargos en los que uno está presente y otro no, o cómo es.
Thanks. Another good question. I think, yes, they're always there. In a model, they're always there. Definitely believe that. Maybe they are not always the most interesting and relevant or consequential. But whether we describe the situation or the conference, I think the various factors that have been mentioned as parts of the model would always be there in some form. Yeah, I believe that, but again, this is how science works. If you can show me a situation, an assignment type where something just doesn't exist, isn't there, is completely irrelevant, this is how we could make progress. And then we need to amend the model and say that this is not a full component, this is optional. This doesn't always happen, because Selina told us that in this or that conference, this component of the model simply could not be found. So this would be interesting to show whether there are some components that don't apply. But my conviction is that they all come into play in our descriptive efforts.
Thank you, Simon.
Bitte. Más preguntas.
Franz, thank you so much for this very interesting talk. Can you hear me?
Oh, yes. Thanks for listening, and it's wonderful to see you here, at least on the screen.
Thank you. Same to you. And it's been really, really great to wind up this very difficult academic year with your contribution. There's a debate that some of the lecturers have been having for a few years now regarding your classification of hypertext, of the different, yes, and that's why I want to ask you this question publicly so you can clear up our debate. And that is that the difference that we have is that some people would seem to feel that there can be several categories at the same time. For example, the seminar that we usually organize, or the event, let's say, that we usually organize for our master's project, that the students have to interpret an event and then analyze their performance. And this is usually what a theme-based forum, I think. But of course, there are different presentations in different languages within that theme-based forum. And some, there seems to be, yes, a body of opinion that would think that each presentation is an invited talk or an invited lecture. But then there's another school of thought that says, well, no, because an invited lecture is perhaps what you're doing, what you have done here today. And if there are several speakers, then there is at least, there's some kind of interaction going on there. there's intertextuality, there's all kinds of currents that for others would invalidate the classifying this as a guest lecture or an invited lecture. I can't actually remember now what the exact terminology was. Yes. So what would your view be on that?
You've made it very clear. Thanks for this, for setting out these positions. To me, it's perfectly clear. There's no doubt whatsoever that second position that you've articulated, that since there is more than one lecture as the event, it cannot be dissociated from this broader level, because as long as somebody says, I know our topic here at this event is this and that, it's already making reference to the broader event that is overarching. So I could not see the individual talks as invited lectures, because they are by definition part of a bigger event. So the way you've explained the second position, like intertextuality, invalidating this assumption of standalone talk, seems very clear to me. Yeah? So if there, and also the organizational consideration, somebody is in charge of organizing it or inviting, who is going to be the speaker at our forum. All of this is a beautiful illustration of this conference level activity, all these phone calls and negotiations, drawing up the program. How could these possibly be just individual speeches? They are part of a bigger event, and that's, yeah, I have no doubt. It depends in terms of research. When you want to look at the text level, I think obviously you can look at an individual speech as a text, as a speech, and describe it, but that's a different level. As long as you try to think, is this an event, a conference, or is this an individual talk? The answer is perfectly clear when you try to decide at the level of a hypertext. But of course, then you're free, whatever the answer is, you're always free to say, what I'm interested in is the nature of the speech and its content and its coherence or whatever. Then the overarching categorization doesn't always play a major role, because you're basically, you have a linguistic interest in these texts, and you can analyze them and compare them. But still, the other level is there if the speech was presented as part of the forum. Thanks for asking me a very easy question. And whoever is a participant in one group or another, I hope I have not lost any friends in Granada now, but I would not make any compromises there. Clear answer, thanks.
Sí, Jan quería intervenir, pero antes de darle la palabra quería simplemente comentar un poquito para abundar en lo que decía Anne, que quizás lo que hace la frontera un poco más borrosa, más difusa entre esos dos tipos es el hecho de que el seminario que organizamos es un simulacro. Y cuando haces un simulacro nunca es exactamente igual que la realidad. Entonces, si fuera realmente un foro temático y no un simulacro de foro temático, la interacción sería mucho mayor entre los ponentes. Y más si se va a hacer por internet y le pedimos la intervención en vídeo, ahí ya no hay interacción, porque cada uno graba su intervención previamente y no va a haber interacción entre unas y otras, ¿no? Y no solo entre los ponentes, sino entre los ponentes y el público. Normalmente en el público, en ese simulacro, estamos los profesores y en algunas ediciones hemos hecho alguna pregunta para hacerlo más real, más vivo.
Yeah.
Pero no siempre se da esa situación. Entonces es lógico que el estudiante, cuando tiene que analizar lo que realmente ha hecho, dice, pues ningún ponente aludía a cosas que habían dicho los otros, por tanto no había interacción, y esto casi se parece más a una sucesión de conferencias de invitados especiales que a un foro temático.
Yes.
Pero bueno, esa es una reflexión pertinente también que se hace en el contexto del trabajo y que creo que tiene también su sentido que se haga, ¿no?
I think it's a very good point, an important point. Fully agree with you, Jesus, there. But then for the organizers, that is good food for thought to say, well, what is our purpose really? Do we, in the interest of students, want to simulate an event, or do we want to just create material for practice, speeches for practice? Because then if you discover that your goal actually is to simulate a complex event, but for technical or other reasons you don't quite manage to generate this level of interactivity that is so typical of conferences, well, then you know where some remedial action would need to focus on, and say we need to have more. For instance, you could have a designated a person asking questions for every presentation. There needs to be 3 questions at least, so that or people who make reference to something else, or let's say every presenter needs to ask a question that makes reference to his own presentation, or that relates his own presentation to what has just been heard. At the level of the event, if that's your goal, if the goal is to simply have live material to practice with, then you don't have to simulate a conference. You can just schedule individual speeches and speakers. But my personal preference would be very much for the training of conference interpreters to focus on simulating an event rather than individual speeches. Because as a student, if you go to the speech repository, or if you go to TED Talks or YouTube, you can always find speeches. But what's difficult really is to get access to this broader communicative event. And if you do a simulation, I think try as hard as possible to simulate that complexity of the event.
Pues es muy buena y muy pertinente la sugerencia. Sí, forma parte de los debates que tendremos que tener y que tenemos, de hecho, cada año. Muchas gracias. Jan.
Sí, yo quería decir que en cualquier caso a mis alumnos, por ejemplo, les suelo decir que a efectos prácticos, y al fin y al cabo de eso se trata en el TFM, ¿no? A efectos prácticos, es decir, para preparar una conferencia, realmente quizás más importante que las categorías de hipertextos de los que disponemos con este modelo, es definir los distintos factores, ¿no?, que definen cada categoría, ¿no? Es decir, el flujo, la densidad de información, etc. Todos estos puntos, creo yo, son, insisto, efectos prácticos más importantes que el objetivo de buscar una categoría a toda costa para cada evento, ¿no? No sé qué opina el artífice del modelo sobre este enfoque.
Yes, I would agree. Without any classification scheme, or even with prototypes, of course, you get examples of things where, you know, a technical conference that is actually trying to negotiate something, or where things overlap. And that, as you say, that is not the problem. Whether you find it difficult to stick an event into just one category, or if you think that maybe 2 types come together and overlap. And if you can use, as you've suggested, if you can use the descriptive criteria to see how are they similar and why are they different, that is definitely more useful than to say, this is number 2 in a pure form, or number 4. This would be ridiculous, because reality, as I said, is so diverse and complex. There's no way we can neatly fit every communicative event into a set of 7 prototypes. But the notion of prototype suggests that there is never a clear boundary, but there may be things where things fit best, the best fit. It's not ideal that all of it fits only into one type, but the most useful best fit that can just give you a sense of orientation, rather than you look at conferences out there and there might be 200 different types, or 17 different types, or 39. So just to put some order, and for graduates, I think when you go onto the market, it would be helpful to understand that there are some different types that have certain features. That was my idea in proposing the descriptive framework, and it could also be used for training. I hope it's useful for training, so that you are not sent out there into this wide world of conferences without any clue of what can hit you, so that you can form categories and say, this is not quite a technical conference, but I think it's similar. In some ways, it's similar to a technical conference. So I'm using my prior experience, all the technical conferences I've done in my training, and I'm working with this hypothesis that speakers will behave sort of like in the various technical meetings that I've experienced. Maybe during the meeting, you might have to shift your categorization. My goodness, these people are fighting all the time. They're really negotiating. I think I'm in a negotiation here. So what do I know about a negotiation? So you could, in actual fact, you could apply various frameworks and you can see how one needs to be replaced by another because it helps you better understand the situation. Do we have any other questions?
¿Alguien tiene alguna pregunta?
Oh, yeah, Margaret.
Hola, buenos días, Franz. Pues lo primero, muchísimas gracias por esta conferencia tan interesante y de verdad que es un lujo tenerte a tiro para que nos aclares muchas de las cuestiones polémicas cuando aplicamos el modelo de hipertextos a los TCM. Como te comentaban, muchas veces entramos en desacuerdo sobre algunas cosillas y mi pregunta era sobre uno de esos temas en los que a veces no nos ponemos de acuerdo, que es el parámetro de la intensidad informativa. Porque me da la impresión, y a lo mejor nos lo puedes confirmar, que la intensidad informativa la vamos a valorar de manera diferente según estemos pensando en el punto de vista de los participantes en el congreso, en el encargo, orador y delegados, o según estemos pensando en el punto de vista del intérprete que se prepara el encargo. Porque claro, si se define como digamos, la cantidad de información nueva o la densidad de información nueva, para dos expertos al mismo nivel, la intensidad informativa va a ser muy baja, porque ellos están siempre hablando de lo mismo y más o menos se lo saben, ¿no? Pero desde el punto de vista de alguien que va desde fuera a prepararse el tema, si son expertos de alto nivel, probablemente lo interpretemos con una enorme intensidad informativa, por la cantidad de información nueva para el intérprete que se está preparando. Entonces, no sé si nos puedes comentar un poco si lo ves así o cómo usar ese parámetro. Gracias.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Margaret. And again, thank you for asking a question to which I think I at least have a very clear answer. I was thinking precisely of the dynamics of the meeting, the participants, the speakers and participants, not the interpreter. Because my basic assumption is the interpreter is always at a disadvantage, is always an outsider, always lacks knowledge that the people have. Maybe only the speaker has the knowledge, maybe the whole group has all the knowledge, but the interpreter is always in a separate situation cognitively. That's why we do our research, that's why we prepare to try and approximate the level of knowledge that the interactants use. So I was not thinking of the interpreter when describing, is there a lot of new information or is most of it generally known? Because as you say, if I have to work for a negotiation, you know, what is the trade unions and some company, they know exactly what they're talking about. I'm the only one who for whom all these arguments and all the information is new. So this would be too easy. I think for the interpreter, unfortunately, there's always a lot of new information in every meeting. And what I was trying to model, to describe, was the dynamics, informational dynamics within the meeting, among the participants.
Gracias.
Thank you for the question.
¿Alguien más?
Anything else? Doesn't have to be on the models. Maybe something topical. Like I like the point about the remote interpreting, which is such a relevant new topic, and obviously this set of models needs to be put in perspective. Maybe we need to be discussing entirely new things here, whether interpreters are needed, whether they're all, what machines can do for interpreters, rather than thinking about context and text and situation models. But any thoughts, any fears, any concerns that anybody would want to share? At least as far as I'm concerned, anything is of interest here. We don't need to discuss Pöchhacker's models. Enough of that. But maybe I've also tired you out. I promised to just show a few slides, and then I caught myself launching into a monologue of 1 hour anyway, so it happens.
No, pero era necesario y era útil tener esa información detallada sobre todos esos modelos, tipos de situaciones comunicativas. Es verdad que luego dentro de esos tipos de situaciones comunicativas hay subtipos también, ¿no? Y hay un subtipo que se repite en distintos tipos de situaciones comunicativas, como es la sesión inaugural. También me gustaría comentaras un poquito sobre eso, ¿no? Porque en la sesión inaugural de cualquier congreso, o de una conferencia, de un encuentro de un organismo internacional, los oradores suelen ser personas que no se quedan al resto del evento, que no suelen interactuar mucho entre ellos porque suelen llevar sus intervenciones escritas, y eso tiene también particularidades que hacen que el intérprete tenga que prepararlo de una manera muy distinta. El intérprete normalmente pone el énfasis en preparar el tema de la conferencia, el vocabulario, la terminología, y las dificultades que plantean los discursos inaugurales son distintas al del resto del evento, pero se parecen a su vez mucho entre sí. No hay nada más parecido a una inauguración que otra inauguración, ¿no? Aunque no se parezcan mucho al resto del evento, ¿no?
Definitely. I think that would be a perfect topic. It's not covered in the typology, because when you look at the entire, let's say, technical conference, the inaugural session is only a part of it, and there is no descriptive level underneath the hypertext level. So that's definitely missing. And I think a project could say, well, let's look at this part of the conference level and what are the features of the inaugural session. I fully agree that I would love to see a paper or description of the parameters, the typical things that happen, the typical protagonists. Usually if it's an academic context, then you will have some representative of the university, the vice rector for research maybe. And I would permit myself this heretic remark that initially there's very low informational intensity in these inaugural sessions, right? Because somebody's saying how important it is to come together, and then there's a few explanations of the history of the University of Granada, and interpreters have heard this. This is probably the only exception, that if you work on the Granada market where you have heard the history of the university before and it's not all new to you. So that's interesting, but then you might get a very challenging inaugural speaker who's been flown in, some guru who's now all over the place, and in some high-level events of some technical specialists, they bring in, I don't know, a famous artist or an actor or a futurologist, and that can be extremely difficult then. All of a sudden, some invited talk or a keynote talk goes off into an entirely different direction. You've done all your preparation for the technical conference, and here comes this strange person who is invited just to spice up the conference. So even the inaugural session might have different parts. There's the welcomes, that's what I was referring to, the welcome addresses by the organizer, by the host institution, that's fine. But then they might say, and we have a very special guest who will get this thinking and moving, and that's where you can be in for a big surprise as an interpreter, because there is no frame of reference to expect the content of this presentation. So, but to think about that, to maybe describe some of these inaugural sessions and see what the typical features are, I think that's a brilliant idea and a very worthwhile undertaking. Also, because sometimes, unfortunately, the inaugural session is the only session that will have the interpreters present. Sometimes there is a plenary main session because the local politicians don't want to speak English maybe, so you have interpreters. But when the technical meetings begin, all of a sudden interpreters are no longer booked or needed, or only in one room out of 6 different rooms. So even the dynamics changes. Is this a multilingual meeting, or is the multilingualism usually is mainly part of the inaugural session? And it's just a fascinating topic. Thank you.
Gracias. Bueno, son ya las 2. No sé si alguien más tiene algo que decir. Si no, pues hemos llegado al final también de la hora prevista, ¿no? ¿Alguien? ¿No?
Well, I'll have to say, talking is fine in whatever mode for me, but the one situation where I really feel so bad about not being able to be with you in Granada is now. It's lunchtime. It could be a lunch with you. And unfortunately, Zoom doesn't make this possible. So this is the worst part of my talk, that I will not be able to join you for lunch. I'm sorry.
Por mucho que haya avanzado la tecnología, las tapas virtuales todavía no existen, me temo. Sí, quedará pendiente para otra vez. Sabes que siempre es un placer para nosotros recibirte en Granada. Y bueno, no hay mal que 100 años dure, ni pandemia que dure tampoco 100 años, ni cuerpo que lo resista, se dice aquí, ¿no? Así que seguro que en otra ocasión podremos tenerte aquí y podrás disfrutar también de la ciudad y nosotros de tu compañía. Muchísimas gracias, Franz, ha sido interesantísimo.
Thank you.
Justo lo que queríamos, justo lo que necesitaban los estudiantes, y también nosotros como profesores que tenemos que orientarlos en esos trabajos fin de máster nos has aclarado muchas cuestiones. Así que muchísimas gracias y ha sido un placer, y esperamos verte físicamente pronto aquí en Granada.
Okay, my pleasure. Thank you. Thanks to you all. Thanks. And enjoy your lunch. Hasta la vista en Granada.
Muchas gracias.
Vielen Dank.
Muchas gracias.
Tschüss.
Bye. Auf Wiedersehen.
Wiedersehen.